Hi, I'm Sophie Phillips. I'm a senior associate in the construction team at Bird and Bird.
Hi, my name's Jennifer Pollard. I'm an associate at Hoare Lea in the sustainability team.
And today we're going to be speaking about trends in sustainability and construction and the associated challenges that go along with it. So, Jenny, let's start off talking about the current atmosphere in the market and what parties are having to deal with.
So, I think one of the big things that's coming forward at the moment is the challenge around net zero carbon
Mhm.
and how clients approach net zero carbon with their assets.
I definitely agree with that. So we know that the UK government has revised its net zero strategy. They've been consulting on phasing out fossil fuel usage in large commercial buildings in the future. And there's an awful lot of legislation looking at dealing with that at the moment. So we've got the implementation and the revision of the minimum energy efficiency standards. That means that commercial leases can only be granted where the property holds an EPC certificate, an energy performance certificate with a minimum rating of E, with some exceptions. That's actually going to rise to C, which is a higher standard, by 2027, and to a B by 2030. We're expecting that to be a really significant priority for our landlord and operator clients because they're going to have to meet those standards. And that means that they're very likely, at least some of them, are going to have to significantly change the way that they operate their existing infrastructure as a result. And I'd say that it's possible that some parties are going to have to spend a considerable amount of money making sure that their buildings comply with those standards. I know that, Jenny, you've been talking about the fact previously to me that a lot of parties are looking into this right from the very start. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anyone designing a building now for development in the next few years needs to be considering these changing regulations and making sure that they are building assets that will be compliant in the future to avoid having stranded assets or to avoid needing to do remedial works in the future where they're building the asset now. It's all about anticipating where the market will be by the time these assets are going to be delivered.
I totally agree with that, Jenny. I think we're seeing a lot of interest from clients who are funders, but also clients who are landlords looking to make sure that the assets they have are definitely going to be usable in the future. And that's usable from a practical perspective, so making sure that tenants actually want to physically be in those buildings, but also usable from more financial perspective. So is the building insurable? Is the building something that parties can actually use? Does it comply with the law?
Absolutely. And we also have more ambitious clients who are looking to not just look at their EPC ratings, but go beyond that and look at design for performance and really changing their operational usage and designing buildings to reduce operational energy right from the outset, changing the actual way that the building's designed to make sure that they're achieving best practice standards. We're seeing more and more of that.
That is interesting because it's a whole life cycle aim, isn't it? Parties have to think about this right from the beginning when they're looking at planning. They've got to look at it throughout the building. They've got to look at it at the point the building is no longer fit for use and is being demolished. People are talking about life cycle, and it's no longer just a buzzword. It's something that has to be considered the entire way through. How would you say that your role at Hawley helps clients with these goals?
So I think when we can be involved right from the beginning of the project and talk with clients at the feasibility stage to help them shape their project brief and shape their goals around their whole life carbon impacts and further to that sort of retention versus demolition, those sorts of conversations, when we can be involved right in the beginning, that helps a lot. And we can help clients to determine what is appropriate, working with the design teams collaboratively, and we can look to set goals for their whole life carbon ambitions and net zero carbon ambitions, and then throughout the process with them to then follow that through and work with the design teams to see how that's embedded in the design.
I think it's a key point here. It's something I like about sustainability. It's a genuinely interesting area. But something I think is quite interesting is it's something that you have to have buy-in from the entire project team. So it sounds like when you're saying Hawley gets involved right at the beginning to make sure those net zero requirements, those sustainability requirements are known to everybody right from the very beginning, right at the procurement stage. And then you're talking about that close involvement with the design team. I know from my side as a construction lawyer, what we're saying is that you have to have buy in from the designers, to have buy in from the clients that are having it built in the first place. You have to have buy in from the contractor as well. You need to have buy in at every stage from every member of the team that is coming together to create this development, because everybody is bringing a different skill set. Everyone is bringing a different set of, I suppose, carbon risk to the project as well. And it's that cohesiveness, isn't it? It's that tying together of all the different strands of the project that help make it a fully sustainable model at the end of the day, isn't it?
Absolutely. Collaboration is so key when it comes to meeting sustainability targets because ultimately, as a sustainability consultant, we can only advise and help shape the project, but the design teams are the ones designing, and the construction team will be the best people, best placed people to advise as to what is actually buildable. So it's about bringing all of those team members together to help shape the sustainability outcomes of the project. And of course, the client buy in is ultimately the most important. So the design team, the construction team, and any sustainability consultant can only help to advise the client, but their money and their sort of aspirations for the project is what shapes what gets delivered in the end.
Definitely. And I'd say from what we're seeing in terms of what's pushing those aspirations, it's not even just the client, it's what the end users are requiring. So tenants are really pushing sustainability requirements. So that might be a sustainability savvy customer who wants a real estate asset that isn't going to add to their own carbon footprint through the supply chain. For example, if they are carrying out their own carbon reporting, even, they're going to want to make sure that the assets that they're renting aren't going to significantly add to their carbon burden. And I'd say that this is going to become increasingly more important in the future. So you've got really sustainability savvy tenants out there, for example, who want to make sure that the buildings that they are renting are going to be energy efficient, that the buildings they're renting have been built in a sustainable way, that they aren't going to require more heating, more cooling, more lighting than a building that could have been built in a more energy efficient way. And I think that's really where you're able to add that value, isn't it, Jenny, through making sure those goals are in place right from the very beginning of the project.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean that's in the ideal case. Obviously, there are lots of cases where we get involved later on and we have to try and shape. But the earlier we're involved in a project, the more impact we can have, and the more at that early stages, the more shapeable the project is. And I think obviously lots of clients are concerned or can be concerned about the increase in capital cost to designing an asset for net zero or designing an asset for really high energy efficiency, for example. But as you say, the attractiveness to a high value tenant and the higher rental premiums provides a longer term benefit over the life cycle of the asset. And we need to be anticipating what's coming down the road in terms of changing building regulations and sort of reputational risk that clients take by not designing for the future standards now, as well as you say, sort of the lower operating costs and a greater energy security as well. So we know that the energy grid has limited capacity and that developments are struggling to find the capacity they need to be able to build the assets they need now. And obviously, the more we can do to reduce energy consumption, reduce the demand, and have greater energy security from decentralized energy networks, is the more likely these assets are to be delivered.
Definitely. I suppose the ideal building would have very little energy input requirements, very little energy output as well, and keep it low cost. But as we know, that isn't always possible. We live in an increasingly digital world, and that digitalization isn't just limited to you and I with our smartphones and our computers. We live in an age of the Internet of Things, and smart technology is everywhere. Buildings are smart, they also require energy to run. And I don't think that's a trend that's going anywhere. So it's something that people are starting to be really aware of. I'm going to just quickly mention something I was talking to one of my colleagues about the other day, which I think is quite interesting here. We've spoken about the fact that organizations are really racing here to hit net zero targets, and energy consuming parties have to be particularly aware of this. And so obviously some assets are more energy intensive than others. As a result, the commercial models for delivering that, is evolving. So corporate PPAs, that's a corporate power purchase agreement, are examples of this. And something that we're seeing again in the market is energy as a service arrangements. So we've seen a bit of a resurgence in popularity here. And we think one of the reasons for this is that a lot of energy consuming organizations with really significant physical assets won't actually be able to fully achieve their energy transition or net zero goals through just a corporate PPA. And an energy as a service arrangement can have other benefits. So, for example, that can lead to enhanced energy security, because it can reuse what might otherwise be a waste output in the building. So heat, carbon dioxide, things that can be used as a fuel source, can also lead to cost savings as well as new income streams. The energy team at Bird and Bird have done quite a lot of work around this, so it's been interesting to hear more about that. And I think it's something that our real estate clients are going to be looking into in more detail in the future. Jenny, you spoke about the cost of complying with the energy efficiency requirements, and I think that's something that's really important to acknowledge. There is a cost associated with this, but as you've said, there are balances to that. So increased income, the fact the asset isn't likely to be stranded in the future, but we know that that isn't always possible. Not all buildings are going to be built from scratch. And a lot of parties have assets in place already that either they aren't in a position to knock down and redo or wouldn't want to, or actually they're concerned that redoing it from scratch is going to be far more expensive that they can manage, or demolition and rebuilding is also perceived very carbon intensive. So I'd like to talk to you a bit more about retrofitting and the associated implications of that. Do you think we're going to see an increase in retrofitting in the future, or do you think it's unlikely to happen?
I hope so. I mean, I think, as you mentioned, sort of from a whole life carbon perspective, it's very rarely advantageous to knock down and demolish a building and then rebuild, even with the perceived improvements in terms of operational performance. Often, with a deep retrofit, you can achieve near to new build operational performance anyway, but the saving in terms of embodied carbon can be major when you look to retrofit versus a new build scheme. And obviously, the more that the grid decarbonizes, the more important that embodied carbon becomes. So, absolutely, we really hope so. I think there are some fundamental things that need to change to encourage developers to retrofit as opposed to new building. Obviously, that is the standard current practice. And I think that things like government incentives and the VAT laws need to be addressed to help to encourage developers to retrofit. But there is a big movement in the industry at the moment to encourage clients towards retrofit. Also, we're seeing that planning authorities, particularly in London, and driven by the Greater London Authority's circular economy requirements, are really pushing for retrofit, and clients and developers project teams are having to justify quite hard why the viability of a scheme won't work with an existing asset on the site to justify the demolition and rebuilding. There is a case that there is an existing asset that could potentially be put forward for retrofit and for a new use.
So I think it's clear then that parties are going to have to take retrofitting very seriously. It's definitely something that a lot of parties are going to need to consider in terms of looking at their assets. I suppose one of the main things that parties are going to have to look at is whether the asset actually is viable for retrofitting in the first place. Would you agree, Jenny?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, as we said about the early stage considerations, this is definitely one of them. Clients need to be considering what is viable versus what they need to commercially deliver on the site to deliver the financial benefit that they're looking for, the benefit that investors are looking for from them. I think one of the things that we really encourage is those early stage investigations. So interrogation of what actually exists within the site and looking at the asset that's there already, things like pre-development audits. The earlier these things can be done, then the better a design team and a project team can understand what they have and can consider the viability of that asset. And I think that links back to sort of what needs to be developed into a project brief at the early stages.
That sounds very sensible to me. You're looking at the cost, you're looking at the time, you're looking at whether it's actually practical. Is this an asset that can be retrofitted? Or would the cost of the retrofit cost so much that it no longer becomes a sustainable investment, even if it becomes a sustainable building? That sort of links us quite neatly onto the subject of offices, doesn't it? I mean, offices has been such a hot topic in the market since the pandemic, when we're all working partly in the office, partly at home, a mixture of the two. There's been a lot of discussion about whether offices are still a viable asset. But our feedback from clients has definitely been that the more sustainable the asset is, the higher class of asset it is, the more likely it is to still do very well.
Yeah, we've seen the same thing. Assets that are being delivered with high sustainability performance have been seeing lower vacancy rates, they've been seeing higher rental rates, and it's a demonstration that that's what tenants are looking for. We see that when we talk with clients about the potential tenants that they have coming in. Tenants are looking for certain sustainability performance metrics to determine whether or not it's an appropriate space for them. Looking at neighbour certification is something that's certainly coming forward on the London market to look at their energy performance, as well as looking at health and well-being as a key driver for tenants these days as well, potentially driven by the well certification, but as well as just embedding health and well-being within the design of an asset.
Yes, this concept of a well building is an interesting one, isn't it? I know it's something that we are seeing a lot of interest in from tenants, whether that's a huge industrial unit, whether that's offices, whether that's a data center, whatever the asset is, we're seeing parties that want a building that is sustainable because they want to keep their costs down, they want to comply with future legislative requirements, they want to make sure the asset's sustainable, but also because they want to encourage people to come and work at it. We live in a world now where the employee workforce has a huge amount of sway. It can be very difficult in some industries to get workers to actually come to site, particularly in logistics is a prime example of that, where the amount of competition for the workforce is quite high. A building that does have conveniences and is built in such a way to encourage the wellness and, well, I think probably enjoyment of the people working within it, it is likely to be much more desirable than a building where this just hasn't been considered.
Absolutely. And when you walk into a well building, you do feel the difference, whether it's actually well certified or whether it's something that has been designed with wellness in mind. It has a big impact. Things like daylighting and air quality, and even the design features, whether that be biophilia or inclusion of nature, etc. It has a massive impact on your wellness in a building. And if you are encouraging a workforce to try and get back, and you're an organization that sees the benefit of having your employees in the office, then there's no more important investment than in the health and well-being of your employees to improve your productivity and reduce absenteeism.
That's a sort of resounding tick in the sustainability and environment box, isn't it, in terms of making sure people are coming back to site? I'm going to change tack a bit here and tell you about the things that I would expect our clients to be including, or I'd certainly be advising our clients to include in contracts to make sure their sustainability concerns are represented contractually. And one of them is on something you've mentioned before. It's about that sustainability data. When anyone is building a project, they are ordering materials from offsite. They are building in a certain way. They are creating waste. They're creating noise, and hopefully not nuisance, but they certainly will be creating some noise if the people who are building an extension on my neighbour's house anything to go by. And sustainability is linked to actually all of these things, making sure the parties have a sustainable supply chain for getting materials to site, making sure the materials themselves are sustainable, making sure they're using sustainable methods of construction. So, particularly modular methods of construction, we're seeing a huge increase in interest around modular construction. It does tend to be seen as a method that reduces the environmental burden due to the fact that entire units are potentially put together off-site, reducing noise, reducing pollution in one place, and very much speeding up the construction process.
I think one of the main benefits from a sustainability perspective of offsite construction is having that factory setting, which makes it easier to control different factors. So, waste is one of the big things that big issues with a construction site. Over ordering of materials, so materials being wasted before they've even been used,
Absolutely.
and then materials being damaged on site, etc. So obviously within a factory setting, it's much easier to control all of this. So the likelihood is that you will minimize the waste. There's also lots of social advantages of offsite construction from a social sustainability point of view, in terms of consistent employment for workers, skills development, etc. So completely agree. We often advocate for that, but we would also say that it's not necessary that offsite construction is always more sustainable. It depends on how the opportunities of offsite construction have been.
It does. And that's why it's so important that that data is gathered. You can have a great way of doing things, but if you're using unsustainable wood, for example, from the middle of the Amazon, that's going to completely remove the benefits that you have of having it actually built in a sustainable way. And I think something that we are finding here is that clients are so concerned about their carbon footprint. They're so concerned about their carbon data, essentially, that they are putting contractual obligations in the main body of the contract to say to the contractor, you must collate this data And I'm going to pass over to you, Jenny, to talk about the kind of data that would look like as set out in the technical documents. And you're going to pass that data to us, and we are going to have a license to use it. And that license, that right to use that data, or sometimes the data is owned completely by the employer, is important because that information is valuable. It's an opportunity for the developer or the landlord, whoever it is, to improve things next time. It's an opportunity for them to use that in retrofitting design later to try and make it more sustainable in the future. Jenny, I'd like to hear a bit more from you about how you see that sustainability data being dealt with in the technical documents.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sophie. We are seeing more and more that we're embedding within the contractual employer requirements a need to comply with a certain level or a certain target for embodied carbon, whole life carbon, and operational carbon as well. Can be driven by planning requirements, can also be driven by corporate targets on the client side. And we're conducting those design stage whole life carbon assessments to see how the building is performing in design, to be able to set a threshold for the contractor that they have to try and aim to meet. In some cases the wording can be more strong, and in others it's slightly watered down in terms of just aiming and carrying out best endeavors to meet a certain number for embodied carbon, because this has massive impacts for the client in terms of their offsetting payments if they wish to be net zero further down the line. So the contractor should be made responsible for keeping a track of any deviations from the specifications, for example, and the impact that they have on carbon, and then potentially employing a third party and providing the information to that third party to be able to conduct the whole life carbon assessment, as I said, which informs the offset payments to then be used for net zero in construction. And this will get more and more important with the new net zero carbon, or is likely to get more and more important with the new net zero building standard that should be coming out later on in the year, which should set performance targets for embodied carbon and operational carbon, which clients and developers have to adhere to be able to then say that their buildings are net zero. So, setting targets within the contractual documents will be even more important at that point.
I would agree with that. And I think it's likely that depending on the contract and the project, we're going to see more stringent requirements on the contractor in terms of actually hitting those carbon requirements. So it might be that you end up with incentives, so contractual incentives in the event the contractor exceeds the goals. So in the event they build a building where the sustainability targets have been met or more than met, and you might see liquidated damages on contracts where the carbon footprint has been exceeded. And it'll be interesting to see how that develops in a world where there are lots of challenges around the supply chain and parties are looking to deal with that in increasingly more innovative ways.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think as we see more regulation and more carbon pricing and carbon payments being made by the client party, that will trickle down within the contracts to other members of the project team.
I'd agree with that. You also mentioned the offsetting, and I think that's quite a pertinent topic at the moment. I know that offsetting can be really advantageous for some parties and they're able to use it as a method for fast forwarding their journey to net zero carbon. Do you have anything that you'd like to add about that?
There's been lots of guidance in the industry around carbon offsetting, and it's quite a difficult subject for some clients to know where to start, because there's a big market for carbon offsetting and there's lots and lots of different offers available. Clients get often are unsure as to which they should purchase. The UK Green Building Council recently released some new guidance around this, but even then, it still leaves the options wide for clients to choose. So I think that there is a very important due diligence piece for clients around purchasing offsets and reviewing what they're actually purchasing, what their money is buying, and making sure that that aligns to their own ethos and their own ethics, as well as making sure that that carbon offset is actually having the environmental impact that they want to have. So there's certainly different values of offsets, and that's something that they need to be very mindful of.
Absolutely. I think there's been quite a lot of output from Bird and Bird on the risks associated with being seen to be greenwashing and associated fines or reputation, and the reputational damage that can come with that. So it's certainly something that we would also recommend clients take seriously when they're carrying out their due diligence. Ultimately, Sustainability is clearly something that clients need to be considering across the board. And I'd say that goes for the entire portfolio, not just sort of one-off asset here. Just make sure the new one is nice and green. This is something that parties have got to be looking at across the board, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think clients need to be, especially clients with large asset portfolios, owner operators, for example, need to be looking at their portfolio and through doing so can seek advantages of looking at the portfolio and efficiencies by doing so. Our in house ESG team works with clients to look at their corporate strategies and develop their corporate strategies and corporate reporting when it comes to a whole range of sustainability outcomes. They can help them with client management as well as sort of the social value. But it's really important that clients are looking and taking that approach, which can save them, save them with efficiencies in the long run in terms of developing a strategy that applies to their whole portfolio. And I think reputationally, it's very important that clients are doing that.
Absolutely. And I think it's fair to say that these sustainability requirements are something that should be considered on every project. And if you haven't been considering them on your projects to date, it's something that we would strongly advise you start considering in the future. It's not just in the UK. There's the Energy Efficiency Directive across the EU, which means that member states are putting various new proposals in place. And our European offices are all looking into those very carefully at the moment. This is something that isn't going anywhere. This push for sustainability, this push towards net zero is coming top down. So we're getting that through the various legislation and regulations that are being put in place. But it is also coming from all angles. We're getting it from funds who want to make sure their assets remain sustainable in future, but we're also getting it from end users, from sustainability savvy tenants, from occupiers, and from the public in terms of that reputational issue that Jenny mentioned, being seen as a green company, a sustainable company, carries with it a lot of weight in the current market. Sustainability is such an important topic, and it's something we're very, very aware of at Bird and Bird. Not only are we keeping to sustainability standards within our own offices, but it's something we are making sure all of our sector groups are very aware of, no matter where we are in the world. Our different sector groups are looking at the different regulations and different standards that are required in different industries and making sure our clients can stay ahead of the curve when it comes to this important topic. Jenny, I'm assuming there's something similar for Hoare Lea.
Yeah, absolutely. At Hoare Lea, we've set our North Star, which is our guiding principle at Hoare Lea, which relates to planet conscious and human centric, which is the filter by which we should look at all of our projects and all of our actions at Hoare Lea to make sure that they align to the North Star and that we are ensuring that we are addressing the climate challenge through all of our projects and all of our interactions with clients.
Jenny, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It's been really interesting to hear about what you do and a little bit more about what Hoare Lea is currently doing and planning on doing in the future around sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast, Sophie.
Hopefully it's been interesting for you to hear a little bit about what Bird and Bird are doing and what kinds of things we're recommending are included in contracts around sustainability. If you are listening and you are interested in sustainability, please do visit our website where we have various other podcasts on sustainability. And if any of the topics on today's podcast have piqued your interest, please don't hesitate to get in touch with Jenny or I, and we'll be very happy to talk to you further. Thank you.